Wonderful to see so many people here today. We'll join together just a moment for a prayer to center ourselves and to be in the presence of the Holy. Our gracious and loving God, whose love is with us in all circumstances of life, we give you thanks for the gift of your presence in this community as we gather to think and to share, to love and to learn. And we pray that as we speak about losses in memory and hopes, that we also speak of the hope that is in your community, your spirit, your presence with us every day. We ask your blessing as we gather together in Jesus' name. Amen. So this is the second in our series on memory loss and dementia. And the first one, we kind of did a couple of videos and looked at what is the start of people's reality in community and in family when someone they care about has dementia. And this time we wanted to get a little more personal, and we wanted to make opportunities for people to share some stories within the congregation, because we know that memory loss and dementia affects a huge number of people and lots within our communities. And most of us have some stories to tell, either with our parents or friends or siblings or ourselves. And we wanted to make opportunities to share those stories today. One of the things about a story is that it opens us to healing and to sharing. And I think when we hear other people's stories, often we get curious about more details. But today we're not going to ask people about their stories. We're just going to receive them as a gift, and we'll share stories and be thankful that we have people among us who share their life experiences, because every time someone speaks, someone else learns. So we're going to be doing that today. So we will have 3 sets of people telling stories, and we won't be using the chat box during that time. But we are going to offer our stories and our listening, and then we'll have a little bit of chance later to widen it open to the rest of the group. And if there are other people who have some experience or some story that they would like to tell, we'll make time for that as well. So Brian, did you want to just introduce the panelists?
Oh, thanks, Deborah. Yes, we... as Deborah said, the focus today is on those living with dementia and their own unique stories. And we're going to hear from 5 people altogether. And we're also going to introduce each, not introducing the panelists, but rather introducing the person about whom they're speaking. And then at the end, of course, we have a very special guest in Jim Mann, and I will be introducing him a little later. But we did want to let you know who's going to be speaking all together. And so, of course, for our first group, we're going to have Gwyneth and Paul Westwick, who will be talking to us about their husband and their father. And in the second movement of our time together, we're going to have Linda and Sarah Nelson, who will be talking about their father and their grandfather. And then in our third, we're going to be hearing from Jim, who will be talking about his and we're going to begin with Roy Westwick. Roy, of course, for those in the Heritage Ryerson congregation, is well known. And I think even in the Heritage Dunbar Heights congregation, for the first couple of years of our amalgamation, Roy was still very much a presence with us in our community. But I wanted to read some words that Gwyneth wrote that I think really articulate who Roy was and why it's so important to hear from both Gwyneth and Paul about him. Roy was Gwyneth's husband and the father of David, Paul, and Sarah. He earned a PhD in mathematics from UBC in 1960, and soon thereafter returned as a faculty member, doing research and teaching for 35 years. He first came to the church, that would be the former Ryerson Church, in 1965, attracted by the excellent preaching and music. A lifelong confirmed agnostic, he nevertheless saw value in the church, and this church in particular, as a force for good in the world, and he cherished his connection here. He helped to organize several tent and trailer weekends and one adult retreat, served for a time on the Administration and Property Committee, and for many years was an evening supervisor, retiring only when evening driving after a move to Richmond in 2011 became a problem. He was also deeply involved over many years in thrift sales, serving at various times as cashier, book department head, and chief cardboard recycler. A minor stroke in 2006 was the first harbinger of medical problems to come. He made a very good recovery, but was left with a small degree of aphasia, that is, difficulty in communicating. A series of mini strokes followed, and aphasia gradually became more noticeable. A driver's medical exam in 2013 revealed a seriously deficient short-term memory, and a diagnosis of vascular dementia was made in 2016. He went into hospital in January 2019 and died 3 months later. His family are all very thankful that, unlike so many dementia patients, he retained much of his personality to the end, still friendly and kind, generous, and willing to like everyone he met. And I think those of us who are friends of Roy would certainly affirm that latter statement, that he was a gentle soul who made friends with everyone. And so with that, I want to turn this over to Gwyneth to talk about her own experience of living with Roy in the midst of a time of change.
I was asked how I came to realize that Roy was experiencing dementia. And the short answer is that I didn't, not until I was told. By the time of his diagnosis, I certainly knew that something was wrong, but I hadn't actually put a label on it. And I wonder now why I took so long to connect the dots. Roy's health problems really began with that stroke in 2006, which actually left very little obvious damage. There was a little loss of dexterity in his right hand, which prevented him from winning snooker games after that. And he had this mild aphasia, just a little trouble remembering the odd word, but more than is normal for most of us. But it didn't seem a big problem. A word that disappeared one day would reappear the next. So it wasn't a permanent sort of thing. And I didn't think of the aphasia as having anything to do with dementia. However, from that point on, there were also other more subtle changes, things you couldn't put your finger on, but it was as if his bright, shining intellect had somehow been hooked up to a dimmer switch, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dial was beginning to turn. A series of mini strokes followed. About every 18 to 24 months, there'd be another one. Each time the CT scan would come back negative, revealing no evidence of further damage. But I did think that the aphasia became a little more pronounced with each of these events, and his light, still relatively bright, seemed to dim a little more. Then in 2013, he turned 80, and was required to take the driver's medical exam. We were both shocked when he failed the short-term memory test. Might have been the first test he'd ever failed. But neither of us registered that as implying any larger issue, and nobody said dementia. I just thought that it was normal as we aged for various bits of our bodies to work less well than they had once done, and that this memory issue was just another bit, a discrete problem, rather like having the air conditioning in the car stop working. Inconvenient, but manageable, and not indicating that any other parts were about to fail. This was just another little thing that didn't work as well as it used to. But in the 3 following years, the dimmer switch was turning more quickly. Roy's walk changed. One day, seeing him from a distance, I said, "Oh, good grief, he looks like an old man." Now, he was probably 82 or 83 at the time, but previously he had somehow managed to have the appearance of a somewhat younger man. So this was a real shock to recognize that his outward appearance was so different, his manner, his motions. Stories of his childhood that he'd been telling me for 50 years or more suddenly began changing as to the time or location or the people in them. And it became clear that it wasn't just his short-term memory that was having a problem. He would sometimes fail to grasp the purpose of a question being asked and maybe give an inappropriate answer. And I realize now that I was starting to feel the need to be vigilant, ready to jump in and intervene to head off any misunderstandings. He was losing his ability to tell when words were being used facetiously. And he wouldn't recognize when somebody was saying something as a joke. He wouldn't recognize that it was a joke. And when it was explained to him, he wouldn't think it was funny. And he was losing some of his filters, no longer picked up on social cues. So one day, when a woman said about something that had been hard enough to do at 50, let alone at 72, he said, "72? You're 72? You're only 72? And he was quite surprised when she bristled and said, "Yes, why? Do I look that much older?" And he looked and said, "No." Oh dear, that was a bad one. In 2016, after a referral to a geriatric specialist, we finally received a diagnosis of vascular dementia. The news took Roy completely by surprise, and he was both shocked and absolutely devastated. What I felt, on the other hand, was mainly relief. I was glad that somebody had finally confirmed that something was wrong and had put a label on it. Though, of course, I was very sad about the label itself. I quickly made sure that Roy's friends knew about his condition, because I felt that once they knew, they would no longer expect him to respond as he would have done once. And I felt that Roy could relax because he would no longer have to keep up a pretense of being perfectly okay. And I could relax a bit as well and not have to be constantly on guard, ready to run interference for him. It was really only then that I realized how tense and stressed I had become in the last 3 or 4 years. The diagnosis was bad news. There is, after all, no remedy. But we consoled ourselves with the hope that the disease would progress slowly and that Roy would be blessed with a good quality of life for some years to come. And that's pretty much what happened. Various tasks became more difficult over time, but I was able to take a larger share of the household duties. Oddly, one of the more problematic tasks was dressing. It was, in fact, partly a verbal matter. Somehow, in Roy's mind, there was a pigeonhole into which dress shirt, sports shirt, t-shirt, turtleneck, sweater, and cardigan had all been placed. And whether he put on the one I had suggested on any given occasion was largely a matter of chance. But he continued to play a fairly crafty game of bridge right up until the last year. And he still enjoyed coming to church and going to the opera, the symphony, and choral and chamber music concerts. In the final year, he became less expressive, but I do believe that he continued to find enjoyment in living almost to the end. And now I'm going to ask Paul to take up the story from there.
Thank you. Well, not really taking it up from there because I'm going to go right back to the beginning. Dad was born here, but of Scandinavian immigrant parents who had not finished high school. His first language growing up was a mix of Swedish and Norwegian. His parents didn't speak English at home because they didn't want him learning their broken English. So he only really started when he went to school. The result was a somewhat idiosyncratic use of language throughout his life, partly accent, but partly usage. Sometimes for humorous effect, replacing an English word with a Swedish word or made up nonsense word, as you do with kids, but sometimes just plain struggling for the right word or name. And name, I remember one of his colleagues was always referred to as non-podlecki, based on the last name that he didn't have. But he could also be a bit sort of absent-minded professorish at times. So that having been the normal state disguised some of the early signs of dementia because, okay, he still doesn't remember a name. The frequency with which he would call me Henry, as in his younger brother, increased a bit, but it had been there before. He was also very self-aware. When we were packing up the townhouse in Richmond, and this would have either been either just before he died or just after, I forget. We found a notebook that he had been using to journal the changes in his health, starting from his diagnosis with prostate cancer and through the first few strokes, and a fairly analytical approach to this. But then you could also see a drastic change in his handwriting after one of the strokes, and then the notes just sort of trail off. One more thing about that self-awareness, a little while before the first stroke, he and Mom had started doing those Sudoku puzzles with the boxes of 9 numbers. And while he was in hospital after that, he asked for a pencil and paper, not to solve Sudoku puzzles, but because he wanted to see if he could figure out how many different unique Sudoku puzzles there could be, a sort of meta-analysis of the game. This led to some interesting discussions about what makes a puzzle unique. He had thought through the questions like, if you just rotate it 90 degrees, is that a different puzzle? Or if you just flip it mirror image, does that count? If you exchange sets of 3 rows or 3 columns, or if you exchange a single row, is that really unique? Now, I mean, the question is of basically no value, but he was interested to know what his mental capacity still was. And working through this question was a way for him to test that. So as things gradually got worse, you have to imagine for somebody whose whole professional life was centered on having an agile and sound mind, it must have been frightening to be aware of that slipping away. And, I did see him getting frustrated by that, but strangely not fearful. And that was in turn comforting for me to see. One of the things that was encouraging, especially in the later years, was his reaction to music. Even as other things fell away, he still enjoyed hearing the choir at church, going to concerts, to the opera, particularly the chamber music series. and was still attending those until a few weeks before his last hospitalization. Now, after one of the concerts, he admitted that, well, the Mozart was really beautiful and the Dvorak was fine, but he couldn't really follow the Shostakovich. It was just noise. And, in earlier years, he had found Shostakovich's music quite fascinating. But I guess just the speed and complexity was starting to get difficult. So, but if there's one thing to take from that, I think it is to cherish the things that still connect and that still work, and to focus on those, even as you find ways around the things that have been lost.
Thank you for that, Paul and Gwyneth. What a really valuable way to start, and for some things for us to remember. The second people who are going to share with us are Linda and Sarah Nelson, about Linda's dad and Sarah's grandfather, John Hammond. And a little write-up here after Anne had a conversation with Linda. She wrote this: John Hammond was diagnosed with frontal lobe dementia, and at the time of diagnosis, caregivers did not have much information about how differently frontal lobe dementia could present. John was known as a gentle, funny, and kind man, but his personality underwent a complete change with dementia. He couldn't filter what he said and made inappropriate remarks that shocked or embarrassed people. He became obsessive, sometimes hoarding. He craved carbohydrates, stole food, and couldn't control his appetite. He had spent his working life as a compositor for the Vancouver Sun, a job requiring dexterity and speed. In dementia, that translated to needing to be constantly busy. He took machines and household items apart in order to fix them, leaving a swath of destroyed things behind him. John retained complex language skills and could remember the names of his loved ones, which made people think he was not really experiencing dementia. People thought John's behavior was deliberate. They thought that his outbursts, anger, destructiveness, and stealing indicated that he was a bad man. Linda's family's struggle centered on advocating for John and explaining his behavior in a care setting where many of the caregivers simply did not understand what they were seeing, and they judged John harshly. And so I wanted to, I think Linda is going to start here.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess what I'll mostly talk about is how our role as a family developed when he went into care, where he wasn't very well understood. And that started with his admission. When after the admission interview, the LPN turned to me and said, "I don't understand why he's been admitted here." Her tone changed about 2 or 3 days later, where he'd already figured out how to get into the nursing station and take various things, including her purse. So we never quite heard that again. My background was in long-term care. I was an RN. My specialty was gerontology and care of people with dementia. And I had this fantasy that I was going to come in and give them all the information that I always hoped that people would give me to understand and give exact personalized care. And so I had my list of all the things that he liked to talk about, and about his hearing loss because he'd had damaged hearing in his work, and he could still read. And that was often the best way to communicate with him, because he wouldn't wear his hearing aids. He had no insight, and he thought his hearing was perfect. And unfortunately, they weren't very open to it, and it was really hard because, as mentioned, they misinterpreted or interpreted his behavior as being deliberate. And because he was so verbal compared to the other residents, they saw it as bad behavior. And even when he would do similar things to other residents, they would see it as being a bad man, taking things, stealing, whereas someone else, maybe with the more typical Alzheimer's, took something, they would say, oh, that's just part of their condition. So that was really frustrating and heartbreaking. And as his behavior became more challenging, there was a fair amount of hostility from the staff, which we also experienced. So it made us withdraw away from the staff, which was really disappointing to me and hurtful. And but what we did find was that there were staff who became our allies that we could count on, and there was hope and love in that. The recreation staff, the music therapist, they understood him from the beginning, and they played to his strengths, his ability to read, his love of poetry. They would have him lead events like on Robbie Burns Day, because he was from Scotland. He would read Robert Burns with his accent. And Remembrance Day, he was very fond of the Flanders Field poem, and they really understood him. The other person who was our ally was a housekeeper named Sylvie, who was one of those angels on earth. And she understood him and saw the man who he was, and was always telling us, if they don't understand him, why don't they see? And it was such a comfort to know that she was around and she was there for us. Things did change over time, and I guess I had pictured myself being this super partner. What I became more of was standing up for him and being an advocate, more than I envisioned. Whenever there were any sorts of surveys, I did the surveys. They had family focus groups. I think they were trying to change things, and there was a lot of changes in management. And actually over time, they started to do a new way of doing care, and really were there to support the staff and educate the staff, and had families participating, and there was a change. And part of that change was, I think, that they were looking how they could support the staff. And I think actually in care, one of the, for a way of doing care, the first thing is how you treat your staff and support them. And I have to commend that change. And unfortunately, we still were in ourselves. And one of my regrets is that I didn't get to know the staff in a new way. And when he was in his palliative days and we were there around the clock, they were lovely and they were supportive. And when he passed away, they were there and grieved him and had understood him. And I didn't have to keep explaining, this is not who he was before. And so my one regret is that while I saw the change, I maybe didn't change some of my behavior. So I think my message is that you might have to take on some roles, maybe speak up a little more than you're comfortable with, and to always look high and low for your allies, because there are allies everywhere and they're not necessarily sometimes who you think they might be. I think that's, we'll pass things to Sarah now.
Thank you. So from my perspective, my granddad was in a nursing home ever since I could remember. I grew up visiting him often, and because of this, I never really had a stigma behind visiting a care home. It was just what we did, and where my granddad lived. The first time I realized this was not everyone's experience was when I visited the nursing home with my children's choir when I was around 9 or 10 years old. Before going into our Christmas concert, they had not told us anything about what it was like visiting a care home. My choir ranged in ages from very young, around the ages of 6 or 7, to the later elementary school years. When we walked in, they seemed shocked, almost scared, and one of the younger kids was almost on the verge of tears, which didn't really make sense to me because this just was where my granddad was. And I didn't really connect that maybe other people wouldn't understand seeing people who may be different from them or who would look or act differently. We handed out the music sheets with the lyrics to all the songs. And as my mom mentioned, my granddad could read. And he did his best to sing along, although with his dementia, his voice was completely monotone. But it was really amazing because I kind of connected with my granddad in a way that I never had before. It really shows, as mentioned before, dementia's connection with music. My granddad often told stories about his childhood, The same ones time and time again about growing up in the war, getting his first job as an office boy at the Montreal Star newspaper when he was 15, and being a Boy Scout. He didn't remember very many current things. In his mind, I think I was always around 8 years old, but he did remember that day and that I sang in a choir. And Remembrance Day was a strangely happy day for my family. Every year, we would gather with my granddad around the TV to watch the ceremony. Often the jets flew by and they were visible from the nursing home window, and we would stand there and watch them go by. My granddad would tell us stories about growing up in war times, and I think that the visuals from the ceremony and the bagpipes really connected with his Scottish roots and brought back those memories. My greatest point in telling these stories is that dementia is not the end of someone's life. Though there certainly were hard times, I also have many good memories of gathering on Remembrance Day and Christmas. Some of these things that my mom and grandmother went through with seeing the change in him, I never really got to experience or fully understand the scope of until I was a lot older. And so it's really about finding the small moments when we'd visit and show up, and my granddad would happily say, "The whole gang's here," or "It's like Christmas," even when it was actually Christmas. And this brings me to the present day. So right now, I work as a program assistant at the South Granville Senior Center. And I had the privilege of this summer being involved in working on their first ever dementia cafe, which is now called the Happy Memories Cafe. This is a safe place where people can ask questions, learn about dementia, and connect with others. This is where I like to tell others of the happy moments I had with my granddad and about how dementia is not something to be ashamed of. And I believe this is why we have to talk to others and learn and educate ourselves, because by doing this, we're breaking down the shame and stigma around dementia, where there really should not be any. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Linda. I feel as if we should just pause for a moment because this has been such a moving testimony, and thank you. This is the next speaker we're going to have. I'm going to share some words about Jim's background that I know he and Sabina were in conversation about, and it'll give you a sense of his own background. But I have to begin on a personal note because Jim's father and my mother were first cousins. So for me, this is not just a guest speaker being introduced, but rather it's a reminder of the roots that we both share. And so it's a very special honor to be able to say a few words about Jim, and then to together with all of you hear what he has to share with us. Jim is a businessman, a volunteer, and an advocate. After a 25-year career with Canadian Airlines, CP, he established a management consulting company. In February 2007, at the age of 58, Jim was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. He had found himself walking through a small airport and suddenly realized he had no idea where he was or what to do next. Jim was once a world traveler, and this diagnosis started perhaps the most difficult journey of his life. He has had to dissolve his company, give up driving, and come to terms with the many challenges of memory loss. Jim has become a strong Alzheimer's advocate. He's a recipient of numerous awards, including a recently awarded honorary Doctor of Laws degree from UBC and the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for his volunteer service to the community. For the past 14 years, he has been an advocate to educate on living well with dementia, stigma, stereotypes, and healthcare worker education. Jim believes assistive technology can support people with disorientation and memory loss. So he always wears a tag announcing he has dementia around his neck. If he needs support, he can use the tag to ask for help, even though he looks capable and independent. Jim's courage and inspiration are a true gift to society. He is a living model of inclusion. His words apply not only to people affected by dementia, but to all people living with differences. And these are Jim's words: nothing about us without us. And Jim, I turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Brian. My journey with Alzheimer's began with my mother, who had Alzheimer's. Following my father's stroke, Alice, my wife, and I helped her transition over a number of years from their condo to independent living and then into long-term care. I was 58 years old when my family doctor gave me my diagnosis in February 2007. And the trigger for my appointment were two incidents just 1 week prior. In my journal, I wrote I was visiting an out-of-town friend, and one day I offered to drive his mom to the library to return books and also to borrow a particular DVD. I drove no more than 1 block from the house, and I'd already forgotten where I was going and why. Thank goodness his mom had the books on her lap. Oh yes, the library. Good. I got the library in my mind. We finally ended up at Blockbuster Video, and by then I'd forgotten the movie to get. Hoping it was a current title, I started at A and did find the DVD, and we returned home. Returning to Canada a few days later, I wrote I was at a mid-size airport and once through security became lost, confused, and disoriented. Through my 25 years with the airline, I'd been to many airports, large, small, foreign, and domestic. But that day I had no idea what to do or where to go, and was definitely not of the mindset to ask for help. I went up the escalator and then down twice. I was frightened. I stood in the middle of the concourse with people whizzing by me, coming and going. I felt like my first day at school, not being able to find my home room. I ended up leaving the secure area, returning to the check-in agent, and starting the process over again. Living with Alzheimer's disease is definitely not a bowl of cherries, but it is also not a total disaster. Yes, adjustments will have to be made, but withdrawing is not the solution. That said, I appreciate that everyone's journey is not the same, and some people may see, for example, a more rapid decline in their post-diagnostic journey. I have encountered challenges. Oh yes, many, many challenges. I'm a hand-washing failure, I wrote in my journal. We're told to sing happy birthday twice, so I put soap in my hand, start washing and singing happy birthday to me. Before I know it, I've stopped washing it and just wishing me a happy birthday. I refocus on washing and forget to sing. Multitasking, I get an F. That is just a funny side tale of living with dementia, and believe me, there are many laugh out loud moments in my life. But there are also many more frustrating and maddening moments. Like what I wrote in January 2015, that I have a number of nice shirts and I love my sweaters, but there are, quite frankly, too many options. So every day I put on a sweatshirt that requires no thought. So that day, Alice agreed to help me pick up a shirt and a nice sweater. And that's the hard part to swallow, that I was 66 years old when I wrote those words, and I needed help choosing my clothes. While I understand the reason I need assistance, it is nevertheless extremely frustrating. After my diagnosis, and then asking myself, what now? I realized I could use the experience I had seen alongside my mother, combine it with my business background and my love of volunteering. I saw what I felt was a need to address stigma, so I rolled up my sleeves and did and continue to do what I can to educate about living with a diagnosis of dementia, to take away some of the mystery surrounding this disease. In this post-diagnosis period, I have become a published author, including publishing solely and with other researchers in respected academic journals. I have written the foreword of 2 texts, and am pleased to be the Jim in the city of Vancouver's YouTube video, Jim's Story. And I currently co-investigate a project that includes 10 people living with dementia, trying to address the stigma and discrimination associated with dementia. I am especially proud that late last year I was honored to receive from University of British Columbia an honorary Doctor of Laws degree in recognition of my work to reduce the stigma of Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, and for promoting the meaningful engagement of persons with dementia. Since my diagnosis, the experiences, the conversations, the reactions I've heard have all added to the richness of my life. Some have been heartwarming, and some have been jaw-droppingly surprising. But I have been privileged to speak at meetings and conferences across the country about my lived experiences and to add my voice within various organizations and advising research. I hope I have made a difference and altered people's perceptions of Alzheimer's and other dementias, as I have promoted the need for a culture change for those of us living with dementia, no matter if newly diagnosed or in long-term care. And today I've been given the honor to speak to all of you. And for that, I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that gift and opening it up. And when you talk about reducing the stigma connected with Alzheimer's and memory loss, it felt so important to our group as we were beginning this, that people are afraid if we speak about it, that somehow something bad will happen. and it's such a gift when someone comes out and says, this is my reality, and here I stand, and I love that. We have a little book that we have available for loaning, and it's Chicken Soup for the Soul, done in connection with the Alzheimer's Society. And it has little vignettes of people's lives, kind of the best times and the worst times, and lovely moments, and really hard moments. And we've heard in our 5 speakers today some of all of that, the joys and the encouragement and the struggles and frustrations. And we thank you for opening it up. And just wanted to check with people in the wider group here. It's hard to know how many people here have no experience with dementia or memory loss. My guess is if you are here and felt called to come to a discussion about it on a Sunday afternoon, that it's probably something that has become important to you. So we're going to give people a moment if they would like to share their own story, a vignette, a moment, a learning, an encouragement, something that has come from your own experience of learning with that. And I think Jordan will have us on gallery view. We might have people wave their hands so that we know who might want to say a word, and then we can make sure to catch you. Oh, Janet Colley.
My sister had a massive stroke last March,
And it caused, so it's not exactly dementia. I mean, it's not a progressive disease. It's a severe brain injury. Well, but the effects are similar, and that's why I am so interested in this point, because she was another United Church minister, a good preacher, a good scholar, known across the country for her work with the National Social Justice Committees and all those things. And now her memory is difficult, although her long memory is still sometimes there. But her ability to form thoughts, intentions, and so on is quite gone. And that's very difficult. She's still in the stroke rehab because the COVID situation sort of stuck there and is really waiting for long-term care placement. So, but I'm grateful that she maintains a lot of her personality and a kind of good spiritedness about working with what she has. And there may indeed be, with the whole neuroplasticity development things, there may be further healing possible for her, and she may be able to recover some abilities, but she will not be able to live on her own, or to to do a lot of the things that people count on doing on their own from the time they're 4 or 5 years old. So that's difficult. And at the same time, almost the same time exactly, my other sister has been noticing some changes in behavior and so on for several years, but they have not diagnosed the type of dementia, but the CT scan reveals brain shrinkage. So they know that that is a progressive dementia type disease is happening. And again, she's in a very good setting and very well cared for. She has a wonderful church connection with folks who bring her cooked meals, and even in the strict COVID situation, have managed to be very careful and caring with her. So, as my big regret is, can't see either of them at this time, other than occasionally by a Zoom arrangement or something, but you can't fly and go and visit. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you, Janet. Yeah, my own experience is with my dad, and he also has, he is a United Church minister, had been probably for about 60 years, and had a PhD, and we started noticing some losses, some more vagueness. Sometimes it just felt like Dad was had been invited to a Hungarian wedding, and he was just laughing when other people laughed, but not quite sure what anyone was talking about. And he would use 30 words when he was searching for one. He'd say, we went out for breakfast and I had some of that, that lovely stuff. Your grandfather would make a big pot. Some people like it with salt. I like mine with brown sugar, and it's kind of a grain. And it was like, he'd work all the way around that whole thing because he couldn't quite get to porridge. And so those kind of things started to notice. And then they morphed into more physical and hygiene things and that kind of thing. So Dad ended up going into care, I think 2 weeks before the shutdown in Toronto with COVID. But we felt really, it was hard because everyone in his care home got COVID, including him, and lots died within a couple of months. But he survived and got his vaccine last week. And it feels like you kind of have the moment. Some days you call and he's not there, and other days you call and you can have a cool conversation about a corner of his life, and he still remembers all the old Scout songs and camp songs, and And it just reminds me how important it is to pay attention to life all the way along, so that you have a library of things to offer, to play with, so that you can keep a connection going. So it's not just at the high point of an illness, but all along during life, you have to kind of pay attention to what makes life good, so you can reintroduce it. Anyone else? Maggie Hosgood. You might have to unmute yourself.
Like Anne, I walked with my mother for about 15 years through dementia. And the first 5 years of that were hell on earth. She was in a stage of denial and anger. And I expect now, when I look back on it, she was afraid of the things that were going wrong and the big changes that were happening in her life. It involved moving 3 times in about 6 or 7 years. And she was reacting to all these changes in her life with anger. After we got through that period, after my dad died, she got sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. And like Anne's mom, she delighted. If you walked in the room, her face would light up. Oh, I haven't seen you for such a long time. How wonderful that you came. And of course, I'd been there the day before, so and there was a great deal of humor too. She never lost her sense of humor. She never lost her good manners. That was, except for the angry stage when she would play bridge and she couldn't remember who was leading or what was trump. Somebody had to sit there and remind her, but she could play the hands like a master. And the same with cribbage. She'd clean up, but whose crib is it? Who dealt? Those immediate short-term, things. So there were a lot of moments of great pleasure when Mom was waxing us, with the cards. And by the time she died at 96, she was just totally sweet. And the staff in the home who looked after her loved her, and they were so kind to her. So it was wonderful to have their support.
Thank you. Linda.
I just wanted to add a few more thoughts, because a lot of people have talked about the importance of music and the connection. And I just wanted to share a quick story from when I was doing my nursing, that we had a lady who didn't really have any family. She was quite aggressive, didn't talk much, and especially around bathing. And but she knew her family, or maybe she's in choirs. She knew all the old songs. And I didn't know very many of them, but from Bugs Bunny cartoons and stuff, I could give her the first line of something and off she'd go with the singing. And the Carries discovered that music was calming with her, but a lot of them weren't of the same background, and maybe even the Bugs Bunny cartoons. So what they did find was a common song to start her off with in the bath was "Oh Canada." So when she was having her bath, you could hear "Oh Canada" reverberating from the bathtub room. And but she was a lot less aggressive, and it was a connection, and just that emphasis that music is such a connection that stays for a long time. So thanks.
Thank you. I'm just going back and forth from page 1 to page 2. Oh, Paul.
Just one of the curious things with, how it can be selective. was actually not from my father, but from my grandmother on mom's side, who'd had a number of strokes. And one of the big losses was in short-term memory. And can remember one of the last times, or maybe even the last time she was over for Christmas dinner, something reminded her of a story from her youth during the First World War. And so she told this story, and it was something about her, I think it was her brothers in the Merchant Marine, but anyway, and the cookies they had. But the end of the story reminded her of whatever it was that triggered the beginning of the story. So that led her into retelling the story, and this went around in circles 3 or 4 times, and we're each trying to come up with some way to divert the story to somewhere else. But at some point, you just have to say, no, we'll hear it again, and enjoy it and cherish the fact that she's actually remembering stuff from so far back.
Exactly. I was a chaplain in a long-term care home in Alberta for a couple of years, and part of my work was on the dementia ward. And this might be a little off color, but one day I went in, and the activities person was in there with 2 men who were quite far gone in their level of dementia. And she was kind of showing them pictures and trying to elicit responses. And they were just kind of staring off into space and not doing a darn thing and not engaging at all. And then somebody farted, and they both burst out laughing. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Like, it's probably the first thing we find funny as humans, and it stays with us our whole life. And just that little moment of connection is like, yep, that's funny. And I just thought, okay, we're still human. We're still in there. Anyone else? Susan. Oh, Susan, I missed you. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted just to say a few words about my mother, because it is very church related, and certainly it was an important element in my life as well. This all happened 20 years ago, and not surprisingly, our family, my brother and I, just didn't know what was happening. Like, we had no idea. My father had died, and my mother moved to an apartment in Dunbar. And there I introduced her to stitch and chatter. She was really a knitter rather than a stitcher, but she also sewed. And she did chatter, and she sang constantly. And this proved to be a core friendship circle for her, as she navigated all her changes in widowhood and the change in location. What we didn't realize was that she was also navigating memory loss. What was amazing, though, and very helpful, was that Stitch and Chatter totally adapted to her needs and abilities, and she continued to be involved with them very happily and felt a great sense of contribution. Unfortunately, it took way too many clues for my brother and I to realize that she was not able to do things that she always enjoyed. The knitting patterns suddenly were very confusing, and she was a lifelong knitter. Making decisions about how to arrange fabric for a quilt just took forever. Then she stopped making her favorite buns. Now, that was an easy one. We took on the bun making. Then she started phoning the police about things that had been stolen. Apparently, that's a very typical pattern. But with work and life, we just didn't fit all these changes into a coherent pattern. And we just kept trying to pull things together and carry on. Once we figured out something was happening, we actually did become concerned, and especially about our safety. And I persuaded my brother to take the battery out of her car. And then we had lengthy conversations about how difficult it was to get it fixed again. And we did things like we took her out more, and then we brought her home for meals more often. And then we talked about what are we going to do, right? We needed to do something, but like this is 20 years ago. How are we going to be respectful? We wanted her to have her own life, but we wanted her to be safe. And it always came around to the same conclusion, that there would be a presenting situation, AKA there would be a crisis. And that's exactly what happened. One night, her neighbors phoned and said, your mother is out on her balcony in her nightgown, and she can't get inside. So we went and I brought her home, and this set in motion some pretty serious engagement with professionals. Fortunately, we were offered some good options. I know that's not always the case. And let's face it, any of these options are really hard, and they're not easily called good in anyone's point of view. And of course, this is a way longer story, but what I really wanted to say to this particular group was that there are two things that were really important, but for different reasons. The church was important, and the crisis was important. The church maintained that steady, non-judgmental, loving relationship with her. She had friends, and she was able to contribute. That affirmed her and gave her meaning. That was so important. And the crisis was important. In fact, over our many other experiences, which I definitely will not bore you with today, but it seems that the crises are necessary. Significant changes seem to require an obvious reason, and a crisis, unfortunately, provides just that. It clarifies and focuses. When a crisis happened, we could all get on with addressing the situation that needed way more resources than we could offer. So thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you. Sabina. Oh, did you have your hand up? Oh, okay. I just was looking at the chair behind you and I thought it was your fingers.
Janet,
If I can add another comment, Sarah, I was very touched with your story about going in with the choir and thinking of my experience of often doing my turn doing the little services at some sort of nursing home setting or long-term care home setting. And bringing in a junior choir was often a nice suggestion, and surely these old people would love having a choir with them, and I think that's probably true, they did. But I also did find a couple of times, like your experience, that some of the kids were really disturbed and distressed by what they saw, and I thought, this is I guess partly it says to me, like, you do need to prepare people, and would that everybody would have some of your experience, Sarah, to be able to say, well, you know, my grandpa's like that, or whatever, or I know sometimes this kind of thing can happen. But I think for many young people who really don't ever see very elderly people, it's a real challenge for them. So important to think about how we can share that experience around, I think, in the church, and how we can introduce people to it in a way that's more comfortable for them than just suddenly facing something that's totally unknown to them. Does that make sense, Sarah?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's important for young kids to learn about this and realize that they're also people, and it's very important, I think, for everyone to be exposed to that, especially at a young age when you're learning, and that's kind of the age where you develop not having a stigma. Like as you grow up, that totally changes how you interact with that. So I think it's important. Absolutely.
Jim, yeah.
Two things, but I worked with a couple of researchers in Victoria in creating an intergenerational choir, and it's Voices in Motion. It's the research project is going very, very well, but the choir itself is includes people with dementia and a care partner if they wish to participate, but also high school students, and they come together and when they initially came together, it was, wow, how are we going to make this work? But in fact, they did, and it's going very, very well. One of the high school students has written a little child's book about the experience, and the Alzheimer's Society of BC had a lunch for the MLAs of I don't know 2-3 years ago, and the lunch was in one of the main hallways in the legislative buildings, and the choir was there to give a concert, and one of the songs they sang was "Hey Jude" by the Beatles, and boy, the people with dementia, the care partners, the young people, all got into it. But the people who got into it the most, I think, were the people with dementia. It brought back some memories, and there were a lot of smiles and hearty singing. And it's intergenerational choirs are gradually becoming a little bit more, or you see them a bit more in other countries, in across Canada and other centers. And so they're gradually beginning to see benefits in doing some of these intergenerational activities. But I just wanted to go back to something that Susan had talked about with the positive aspects of the or the Stitch group, and how everybody sort of worked with your mother, and I guess my experience with my mother in somewhat similar circumstance is part of what encouraged me to start the to how I started the realizing that stigma needed to be addressed, because my mother went from her condominium that she had shared with my father into independent living, and every day the same group of four would always sit at their, whatever table, but it was always the same group of four at the same table. And one day I was on my way back to Surrey where I am, I stopped and went in to see her, and it would have been sort of at the end of their lunch. And I went to the table, and there were 4 people sitting there, and one of them was not my mother. And so I got a bit concerned and said, "What happened to Margaret?" And I discovered they had her moved. And so she was put in a table over in the corner. And I realized then that here you've got her peer group, roughly the same age, but the adapting to someone having dementia was, I would suggest, somewhat scary for them, was not comfortable for them, and so the easiest thing to do was, we'll push you aside and get somebody else, and that's when I really saw the stigma up close and personal. So.
Thank you. Thank you. And so as we're wrapping up our stories here, I appreciate that, Jim and Sarah, because we did want to get back to our kind of panel speakers and ask if there was anything that kind of caught them in the conversation, give them another shot to see if there was something else they wanted to add, or something that came up in the conversation that they would like to say as well. Gwyneth, did you have anything?
There. Now, what was I going to say? Yes, one of the doctors that Royce saw later on advised us that right away we should start recording his stories from the past and asking questions, and anything we wanted to know about his early life, his background, whatever, we should be asking now. Make a tape recording or write it down, whatever, because later on it would be too late. Well, unfortunately, by the time we got this advice, it was already too late, and the memories were either scrambled or just not there at all. So we weren't able to do it. But I've thought since that, maybe we should all be writing our memoirs right now, just in case. So that's my thought for the day.
All right, thank you. Thank you. How about you, Paul?
I will second that. You don't know when it's too late until it is too late. And so, you might as well start recording stories early and often, and you make more stories you can add to the memoir.
Linda?
I just wanted to thank everyone who came today to listen or who watches this later on, because there were a lot of times where I felt like I couldn't talk to people about it. And I just really appreciate everybody listening. And I think the more we talk about it, the more we can not have people feel like Jim's mom and my dad at times. So thank you.
Sarah?
No, I don't really have much else to add, but again, I'm just really happy that this has been a group discussion, and hearing other people's perspectives have been really enlightening for me. So thank you.
Jim?
Getting a diagnosis of Alzheimer's is, or other dementia it's a journey. And it's a journey. A journey is, often what you make it. And many people with dementia, and I consider myself the same, say that they've actually had a very good life with dementia, and they've had situations uh, that they and opportunities that they would not have had otherwise. And so they're, as much as dementia is scary, not exactly as I say, a bowl of cherries. There are moments and there are opportunities, and so I just like to emphasize, I guess, the positive, because there are way too many negatives. But I do appreciate this opportunity today, and like Linda, thank everybody for tuning in today. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. It really was. Our committee is so grateful for the kindness of our 5 speakers who led us into this conversation, because it's so important, and you've been a real gift to us. So thank you to all of you who've led us here, and a reminder to people that if you're having some experiences either of cognitive losses, or if you're a partner or a child or a parent of someone who is, that Brian and Maggie and I are available to have conversations with you and support you, and we'd be happy to have that kind of pastoral presence if you want someone to talk to one-on-one. But also, we're pretty committed to having this public conversation go on. We've been following kind of the Affirm process, where we're talking about being public, intentional, and explicit in our support of being an inclusive community. And some of you have touched on how that really made a big difference to people you love. So we're going to continue to talk. There's kind of 3 areas that we're looking to really think about as a congregation, as a church. And one is, how can we be compassionate and good for each other, and just know when those triggers are, when we have an aha moment and say, this might need some help, and lessen the stigma. So how can we become those people who know and understand, and like Sarah is just like part of our what our experience is and what we know. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, how can we do some programming that is specific to be inclusive for people who are having some memory losses, or some circular stories, or those kinds of things. How will we make sure that when we can do programming again, not on Zoom, that we have things that are inclusive of people of all levels of participation? And the third thing that we've been asked to really look at is our buildings, and how can we make things clear and accessible for people moving around who might, like some dementias, have some issues with visual things. That some things look slippery or shiny, or like water or something, they can be confusing, or signage can be confusing. So we need to think as a church about how to make our accessibility cognitively accessible too, so that it's not confusing when people are moving around and we say, we're going to do this next, that it just makes sense where that's going to happen. I would like to thank everyone for coming and making this just such a rich conversation, and obvious jumping off point to the next place. And thank you for your care of each other, and the way that you are loving and gentle and warm with people who who go through hard things. So God bless all of you this afternoon and into the week ahead, and we'll let you know what's coming in the future.